The British public may have supported the Nuremberg executions, but by the 1950s, there was increasing disquiet at the continued use of the death penalty. In 1953, this unease was evident in the case of Derek Bentley. Bentley, along with his accomplice Christopher Craig, were stealing from a warehouse when they were confronted by the police. Craig fled, but Bentley was arrested and was alleged to have shouted, "Let him have it," moments before Craig shot dead PC Sidney Miles. As Craig was only 16, Bentley would hang for the murder.
It also transpired that Derek Bentley had a mental age of something like 11, that he came from a rather disturbed background.
These facts were withheld from the jury at the trial.
He had certainly not been the leader in this enterprise of breaking into this warehouse. He'd been easily captured by the police, and the police simply said that he had shouted out to Craig as he came up onto the roof, "Let him have it." That was much disputed.
The case rested on the prosecution's assumption that "let him have it" was an encouragement to shoot the policeman, not to hand the gun over. But many of the public disagreed with this interpretation, and there was even doubt that he had said this at all.
I think everybody thought that he would be reprieved. And when he wasn't reprieved, there was a great deal of public concern, both in the press, but also by people going along to the prison in the morning and creating a large demonstration.
The apparent injustice led to some public sympathy for Bentley, and to a questioning of the state's right to execute a mandatory death sentence on a vulnerable individual.
I think what that demonstrated was that to have a system in which the death penalty was mandatory for murder, and in which every way of trying to classify murders as those that were death-worthy and not death-worthy came down to a political decision of a Secretary of State. That particular Secretary of State decided that he would not act in the favour of Derek Bentley. So there seemed to be a gross unfairness in the case.
Bentley's case caught the public's attention through its coverage in the press. Through the 1950s, capital punishment began to be openly debated on the pages of the nation's newspapers.
Britain had one of the highest rates of newspaper readership in the entire world. And there's enormous competition between, the People, the News of the World, the Mirror, the Mail, the Express, and so on. And they use those classic Victorian staples of sex and sensation and murder and whatnot to sell copies.
In 1955, the press seized on the story of Ruth Ellis, a young woman sentenced to hang for the murder of her lover.
We'd have to say that there's an element of interest in the fact that it was an attractive woman, that it was a crime of passion, so-called. She wasn't necessarily a sympathetic person. In those times when promiscuity was decried even more than today, she'd had a couple of lovers, she had 2 children. There were quite a bit of concern that she didn't just shoot him once, but several times.
But there was a degree of public empathy for Ruth Ellis. Like the Bentley case 2 years earlier, people questioned whether this crime of passion should carry a mandatory death sentence.
The idea that a distraught woman acting in a passionate moment would go to the gallows, I think caught the public imagination and made people question whether that was the right thing to be doing to a young woman. And And that raised the further question then, if it was not right to do it for young women, was it right to do it to young men? And so I think the debate, if you look at the papers, I think she is and the way her case was treated, was the catalyst for what would later become a campaign.
Both Bentley and Ellis were hanged by Britain's chief executioner, Albert Pierrepoint. Such was the controversial nature of the Ellis and Bentley cases that in 1957 the Conservative government passed the Homicide Act, which introduced the new defences of provocation and diminished responsibility for murder.
So they brought in that some murders would be capital murders, what the Americans call first-degree murders, capital murders, and other murders, the pub fight, the domestic dispute, or whatever, would not be.
This law resulted in fewer executions, with only 5 or 6 people a year being sent to the gallows. But the Homicide Act caused confusion.
We don't know why some are hanged and some reprieved. One Sunday newspaper posed this question and gave these examples. Francis Forsyth, 18, murdered Alan G. as he was walking home. He robbed him and kicked him unconscious with his pointed shoes. Forsyth was executed. But David De Duca, 21, did much the same thing. He battered an old man to death and stole his wallet. De Duca was reprieved.
Those sort of anomalies convinced quite a lot of people, including members of the judiciary, which was the other change really took place in the 50s and early 60s. You actually got members of the judiciary thinking that this just wasn't going to work anymore.
The debate over capital punishment peaked in December 1964, when a Labour MP, Sidney Silverman, submitted a private member's bill to Parliament. Silverman's bill proposed an experiment, the suspension of all executions for 5 years. On the 21st of December 1964, as Parliament debated this bill, the BBC screened a live debate between proponents of capital punishment and abolitionists.
In 2.5 hours from now, we shall know whether or not hanging for murder is likely to be abolished in Great Britain. At this moment, the House of Commons is locked in debate on capital punishment. There'll be a free vote at 11 o'clock.
But I believe that this particular penalty for particular people, namely professional criminals, is the one real deterrent.
This argument about deterrence, of course, is the standard argument that's been put for 150 years in respect of every form of capital punishment and has always been proved wrong. Astonishing that Henry Brooke should bring testimony today to say that he's now convinced that that particular argument cannot be borne out.
Later that evening, Sidney Silverman's bill was passed by 200 votes to 98. But it didn't reflect public opinion on the issue. Despite much sympathy for cases like Bentley and Ellis, there was still widespread support for capital punishment.
In polls in the 1960s, people said the one thing about the whole of the 1960s that they disliked most was the abolition of the death penalty. So what you have, effectively, is an elite-driven, kind of liberal establishment project to reform the death penalty. Now that comes from, I guess, education and from a different moral outlook and whatnot, but it also rests on something that we just simply don't have today, which is a sense that the people in Parliament know better. They know best, and they are not dependent on the kind of popular will, if you like, on popular opinion for their mandate. So, in a funny way, the abolition of the death penalty would be impossible in today's Parliament. It's something that was only possible in the 50s and 60s because they didn't have that kind of populist political culture that we have today.
Despite Parliament's ruling, the debate over capital punishment continued to rage throughout the 1960s.
And they were expecting that if you could abolish it at Parliament, that you could also bring it back through Parliament. So naturally enough, any high-profile case, especially one which might, as it were, lead to at least bringing it back partially, say for the murder of policemen, or for a particularly violent set of murders. These were leapt on by newspapers in order to try and reverse the decision.